Julie Hagstrom. I'm the Assistant Director of the Asian Studies Center, one of the co-sponsors today. We're here to hear Stephen Cook present on Turkey, from democratic transition to elected autocracy. Welcome. I'm glad to see such a good-sized crowd today.
They're getting graded on it.
Yeah, that's right. I want to thank our co-sponsors while I have the opportunity. The Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, the International Studies and Programs, our college, and the Muslim Studies program. Stephen Cook is a senior fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's an expert on Arab and Turkish politics as well as U.S. Middle East policy. Cook is the author of False Dawn, Protest, Democracy, and Violence in the New Middle East, The Struggle for Egypt from Nasser to Tahrir Square.
You have to work on your Arabic.
I know, you're right about that. I studied a lot of French.
That's why.
You'll have to correct me soon. This last publication won the Washington Institute for Near East Policy's Gold Medal in 2012, and Ruling but Not Governing the Military and Political Development in Egypt, Algeria, and Turkey. With that, I welcome Stephen Cook.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's nice to be here on April 3rd. Although from where I come from, this looks more like January 3rd. But it's nice to be here. And thank you all very much for coming. I realize that many of you are being graded to be here and might otherwise be somewhere, want to be somewhere else, like the dairy store, which I had earlier today, which was awesome, by the way. I'm sad I didn't go to like a Big Ten school because I never had a dairy when I went to school. Anyway, it's a particular pleasure to be at MSU and in Lansing, Michigan, because any opportunity these days to get out of Washington, D.C., I'm more than happy to get out of Washington, no matter actually where it is. This week I'll be here. Friday I'll be in Bonita Springs, Florida, and then I'll be in Canton, New York, which is even further north than here, via Ottawa, Canada, the coldest capital in the world. So I'm really, really happy to get out of Washington, and I'm really happy to share some thoughts with you today about Turkey. But before I start, I see a lot of students here. So just before I start, how many of you, if any of you, have ever been to Turkey? Awesome. Okay. And how many of you are taking a course that is somewhat or tangentially related to Turkey? Great. And how many of you have ever studied Turkish? And how many of you like Turkish food? No, I'm kidding. How can that? And how many of you are actually Turks? Because I have a caveat for Turks. Okay. To my Turkish friends here, and this is something that is a relatively new aspect when I lecture about Turkey, which is my lecture is based on observations and research. So if you don't like what I said, it is not a personal attack on Turkey, the Turkish nation, President Erdogan, the Turkish armed forces. I'm not a member of the Güvenist organization. I'm not a member of the Justice and Development Party. I'm none of these things. I'm an American who went to Turkey for the first time in 1992 and absolutely fell in love with the country and made it part of my life's work. So, if you don't like what I said, let's engage on that issue intellectually. Let's not get personal about it. If you know anything about me, I'm relentlessly and savagely attacked by supporters of the Turkish government on Twitter, which makes for a generally unpleasant experience. And I never get an opportunity to say to them, let's talk about this on an intellectual level. So if you're Turkish and you don't like what I have to say, let's talk about it. Let's not insult me, okay? Anyway, okay, those are just my caveats before I get into it. My topic today is Turkey, from democratic transition to elected autocracy. Turkey is, when I started thinking about this lecture in a good, oh, you know what, my microphone's in the wrong place. When I started thinking about this talk and my book, False Dawn, which is in part about Turkish politics over the course of the last 10 years, I was thinking about Turkey as a unique case of a country that had embarked upon political reforms and was an aspirant to be a member of the European Union, an actual candidate to be a member of the European Union, a very exclusive club of democracies, that it had become a rather unique case in the rollback of democratic reforms. Now, when I started thinking about this topic, this was 3-4 years ago, I can't necessarily make the case any longer that Turkey is unique in rolling back democratic reforms. We have other cases of that in Europe, and in fact, again, this is, for you Americans here, this is not a political statement, but an observation. There are people who are worried about the rollback of democratic principles here in the United States, in the current political environment. Be that as it may, Turkey is a very, very interesting case of a country that had embarked upon important reforms and now finds itself in a very, very different place politically. Now, there are questions. There are questions as to whether Turkey was a democracy to begin with. If you don't want to sit in the front, there's seats back there. I can understand that sitting in one to sit in the front. I'm just kidding around. You didn't have to move. All right. I remember what it was like to be an undergrad. I never wanted to sit in the front either. And I went to a much, much smaller school. The school that I went to was the size of one of your dorms. So there was probably like 6 people in the class, so everybody would huddle against the back. And, there are questions whether Turkey was ever a democracy to begin with. It is true that Turkey has had regularly scheduled multi-party elections since 1950. But between 1950 and arguably 2002, there were a number of reasons to question whether Turkey was actually a democracy or a quasi-democracy, or was making a transition to democracy, or was democratizing, as many Turkish officials would say. And the most obvious of those things were the 4 coups d'etat that happened in Turkey between 1960 and 1997. In 1960, the Turkish military ended a government it did not like. In 1971, it ended a government it did not like. In 1980, it ended a government it did not like. And in 1997, it ended a government it did not like. It used many different modes to do those things. In 1971, for example, was a coup by memorandum. They sent a memo to the prime minister and said, do X, Y, or Z, or else. They tried that again, by the way, in 2007, but it was actually published on the Turkish military's website, Sign of the Times, instead of typing out you guys don't remember typewriters. Justice and Development Party, known commonly by its Turkish acronym, the AKP, sometimes I'll say AKP because I've studied Turkish and I know how to pronounce it. The Justice and Development Party came to power. This was a party that was a successor party to a number of Islamist political groups that had preceded, that had been closed in Turkey's officially secular political system, either by court order or during one of those coups d'etat. And when the Justice and Development Party came to power, lots of people here in the West were worried, and lots of people in Turkey were really worried about whether the Justice and Development Party would end Turkey's official secularism. But at least initially, they surprised a lot of people by undertaking a number of constitutional reforms. They undertook actually 4 major constitutional reform programs to the extent, and started transforming the Turkish political system to the extent that the European Commission, which had been monitoring Turkey's progress, Turkey had a program in order to meet what was called the Copenhagen criteria. In order to join the European Union, you have to meet certain criteria, and the European Union was in charge of monitoring this progress. And in the fall of 2004, the European Commission recommended to the European Union that Turkey had made so much progress that while it hadn't actually fulfilled the Copenhagen criteria to the letter of the law, still, Turkey should get an invitation to join the European Union. This was the culmination of more than 40 years of effort and a clear indication from Europe, from the West more generally, that Turkey was genuinely making progress towards democracy. How different things are between the fall of 2004 or the spring of 2005, when Turkey actually began negotiation to become a full-fledged member of the European Union, and where we are. They began that in March 2005, and here we are in March 2000, or I guess it's April, even though I said it looks like January, and I still think it's March. But here we are 15 years later, and how different Turkey looks. How different Turkey looks. For any of you who've been following Turkey, even casually, over the course of the last year and a half, you would be aware of a major purge that's underway in Turkish politics. More than 200,000 people have either been arrested, detained, fired from their jobs, driven from the country. When you think about those people in terms of their families, you're talking about millions and millions of people. So to the casual observer, where is this coming from? This began with the failed coup d'etat of July 2016. On the night of July 15, 2016, elements of the Turkish armed forces tried to overthrow the government. They failed because Turkish society, average Turks, supporters of the government, non-supporters of the government came out into the streets and said, we don't live in a society where the military takes over any longer. We reject this. And the coup d'etat fell. And when President Erdogan returned to Istanbul in the early morning hours of July 16th, he said the coup is actually a gift from God because it would allow him to go after his opponents. And we have seen this purge ever since. But actually, this purge, this cleansing of the political system, of the opponents of President Erdogan and the ruling Justice and Development Party, actually began much earlier. You can even trace it back to 2007. Since that time, the Turkish government, the ruling party, has sought to institutionalize the power of the party and the power of the president. Even before the coup, even before this massive purge, President Erdogan had accumulated a significant amount of power in the Turkish political system. More power in the Turkish political system than, dare I say, the founder of the Turkish Republic, Mustafa Kemal, known universally by the name that was consecrated to him by the Turkish Grand National Assembly in the 1930s, Ataturk, Father Turk. The stunning irony of Turkey today is that rather by now, if Turkey began negotiations to join the European Union in March of 2005, everyone who was looking at the situation then believed that Turkey would either be a full-fledged member now or on the verge of becoming a full-fledged member by April of 2018. The stunning irony is, rather than looking like a European democracy, and I realize that there are a number of European democracies and members of the European Union that look less like a European democracy than they're supposed to. But rather than looking like a European democracy, Turkey looks like an elected autocracy. Okay. How in the world did this happen? How did you have a country that was extolled for being a model, think about the language that people use, a model for Muslim societies, a democratizing, prosperous Muslim society? How did it go from that to what I just said, an elected autocracy? Well, that's my opening statement. But now let me give you some background to think about as I go through how this happened. The first thing to keep in mind is that this is in part, and this to those of you who are Turks or scholars of Turkey, this may sound either obvious, banal, or something that only a Western analyst of Turkey might say. But nevertheless, I think it's largely true. Part of why Turkey is where it is today is a function of, first, a situation born of Turkey's endless struggle over culture and identity. This is what, in my kind of informal conversation, I refer to as the Ataturk whammy. Mustafa Kemal forged a new ethno-national state out of the Ottoman Empire and said anybody who lives in this new state is ethnically a Turk. And you couldn't really be anything else. You were a Turkish first, you were a Muslim second, and you were nothing else. There was a political imperative in that. But you were a Turk, you were a Muslim, and you strove to be part of the West. Yet what happened when the West says, you're too Muslim, you're not really of the West, and you're not also all really Turks? There's a lot of people who aren't Turks. There's a lot of Kurds, 20% of the population, by now 16 million people or more. There's remnants of a Greek community there, even remnants of an Armenian community there. Tiny, tiny number of Jews. There is this endless struggle. If you are told that everybody's an ethnic Turk, and you're part of the West, but the West says you're not really part of the West, but you're not even really part of the East because of the radical reforms that Ataturk undertook, where are you? Where do you belong? What is it? When I was living in Turkey, I remember people who are, well, about your age at the time. I'm making a gross generalization about your ages. There are some of you who are older and some of you are younger. But about your age at the time who said to me, Stephen, why do we have to be part of the West? And why do we have to be part of the East? Can't we just be Turkey? Can't we just be Turkey? This, to me, was an important and wise kind of insight about the struggle over culture and identity in Turkey. The second background piece of information to understand what has happened in Turkey, how it's gone from a country that was a promising aspirant of the European Union, the most exclusive club of liberal democracies in the world, to an elected autocracy, is quite frankly the paranoia of Turkey's leader, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Now, paranoia is an excellent, excellent quality in a politician. Excellent. If you want to be a politician, you better be paranoid. You better run every single time like you're losing. And let me tell you something. In things that I have written, I have been critical of President Erdogan. I've been critical of President Erdogan because he's an authoritarian and offends my sensibilities as someone who thinks of himself as a liberal Democrat and a cosmopolitan. And I've criticized him for doing things to journalists and academics and whatever. But that doesn't mean that I don't think he is an absolutely brilliant politician. Incredibly shrewd, incredibly brilliant, and charismatic. I have been in his presence any number of times, although I'm no longer welcome in his presence. But I have been in his presence any number of times. And I have been in rooms where 95% of the people in the room are not Turkish speakers. They're all English speakers, and he's so charismatic, he brings those people to their feet, tears to their eyes. He is extraordinary. Recep Tayyip Erdogan is so good. He's so good. If there was a really good article in the New York Times just yesterday about his oratory skills and how he can kind of reach in and touch the way average Turks feel about things and articulate them in extraordinary ways. He's a great politician. So he's got the good paranoia of an excellent politician, and he has a double paranoia because he's a Turkish Islamist. And if you're a Turkish Islamist, you gotta worry about what the Turkish establishment, apologies to anybody here who's a member of the Turkish establishment, what the Turkish establishment is gonna do to you. He has, through, as I mentioned, there were 4 coups d'etat. The predecessors of his Justice and Development Party were closed by court order or coup d'etat. He was sent to jail for reciting a poem written by one of the ideologues of Turkish nationalism. Now, of course, there's controversy whether he added lines or he accentuated certain lines, and they were coded for his followers, and he was creating religious dissension in an officially secular society. Nevertheless, he went to jail for it, something that a committed secularist would not go to jail for, and it has fed throughout his 15 years in power his paranoia. Keep that in mind in thinking about what has happened in Turkey over the course of the last 15 years. Background thing to understand is that as good as the Justice and Development Party is, as good as Erdogan is, his opposition political parties are the worst parties, I think, well, I wouldn't say in the world, but close to being the worst parties in the world. The main opposition, Republican People's Party, Ataturk's party, is bizarrely crazy. I don't know how else really to describe it. It is not really a party. It's just a front. At this point, it is a front of people who who dislike Erdogan and the Justice and Development Party. I remember when the leader of that party, a guy named Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, came to Washington, D.C. First of all, it took him 2.5 years to decide whether to come to Washington, D.C. because everybody in Turkey kind of trades on anti-Americanism, and he had to weigh whether it would be politically okay for him to come to Washington or he would be criticized by it, by the other anti-American parties in the political system, including the Justice and Development Party, but whatever. And he came to Washington, he had a series of private meetings, and I was fortunate to be invited to one of them. It was a small group of people sitting around the table with Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu, and he's telling us and talking to us, Erdogan's a jerk, Erdogan's actually a really big jerk, I don't like Erdogan, we don't like Erdogan. And finally I raised my hand and I said, Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu, thank you for coming to Washington. I've been sitting here for 45 minutes. I understand what you don't like. Can you please tell me what you stand for? I said, I know what the Justice and Development Party, I know what Mr. Erdogan stands for, and I can tell it to you in about 6 or 7 words. He stands for prosperity, religious values, and Turkish power. How many words is that? Like 6? Okay, so I said, can you tell me, doesn't have to be 6 words, maybe 3 sentences. What is it that your party, the main opposition party in the Republic of Turkey, the standard bearers of Republican secular Turkey, what is it that you stand for? What is it you believe in? What is the positive vision for the future that you offer Turks that would make them want to come out and vote for you? And he went on a half-hour rant about how much he hates Erdogan. I was like, this party's never going to win anything other than the 25% of the people that always vote for them in certain parts of the country because they can't articulate what they stand for. That's the third background. It's just, 15 minutes in. This is going to be a long talk. Get comfortable. I'm kidding. Once I'm through this, it'll be quick. And then you guys can go. The fourth background thing. Remember, in the last 15 years, despite the uprisings in the Arab world, despite the Bush administration's freedom agenda, that by and large, the international environment has not been favorable towards transitions to democracy. We're not living in a democratic moment. What we're actually living in now is decline or rollback. But certainly in the years leading up to it, I don't think, in looking back at it, having lived through the Egyptian uprising in January 2011 and feeling exhilarated by that, having been in the Gezi Park protests and thinking, wow, something's really changing. But if you look back on it, this was not a moment where, like in 1989 and 1990, where there was this sense of change. This was an international environment where ultimately, for the United States and the European Union in particular, where people didn't really mind authoritarianism and don't really mind the authoritarianism of Turkey until it starts impacting their own people, and we can talk about it. Okay, so that's the background. More specifically, how did we get here? What happened in Turkey that you talk to people and you say, God, they say, well, they don't say God, they say, we missed the Erdogan of 2002 to 2007. That was the period of constitutional reforms. That was the period of consensus. That was a period where things seemed to be going very well. Well, there were a couple things that happened that convinced Erdogan that no matter what he did, the Turkish elites, what he refers to as the white Turks, interestingly enough, the military establishment, the Kemalist elite, big business that had traditionally dominated the economy, Kemalist journalists, judges, whoever, they were never going to let him rule and govern the country. The first was an attempt in May of 2007. I referenced it briefly in my opening remarks. In May of 2007, the military tried to prevent Abdullah Gül, who was a founder of the Justice and Development Party, a partner at the time of Erdogan in the founding of the party, who had been ably served as the prime minister for a short period of time and had been a very successful foreign minister of Turkey. They tried to prevent Abdullah Gül from becoming the president of the republic, primarily because Abdullah Gül's wife wears hijab. She wears Islamic headscarf. And in their statement on the Turkish General Staff's website, they said that they did not look, I'm paraphrasing, they did not approve of the headscarf in the Çankaya Palace, the then presidential palace. That was the first thing that happened. Remember, Erdogan's paranoid. Remember, you have this kind of cultural identity issue that's been running through almost 100 years of the Turkish Republic. Remember, you have kind of weak opposition parties. So that's the first thing that happens. The second thing that happens, also in the summer of 2007, is the revelation of something called the Ergenekon conspiracy. Never mind, you don't have to know what Ergenekon is. Just that there was an alleged conspiracy, the Turks are smiling at me right now. There was an alleged conspiracy of the Turkish deep state. You've heard the term deep state reference here in the United States. All those people get on Fox News and talk, sorry to Fox News watchers, all those people get on Fox News and say deep state, they got it from Turkey, which is kind of amazing. Anyway, that Turkish military officers, retired and currently serving, intelligence officers, the Turkish version of the mafia, hardcore Kemalists within the academy, professors, academic administrators, journalists, were conspiring to destabilize Turkey that would force the military to step in and restore public order. And this began when there was a discovery of weapons and grenades in the basement of an Istanbul apartment building. Okay, that's the second thing. The third thing, these are all kind of things, and so there was this belief that people are out to get Erdogan, to inspire a coup d'etat. Then there was what was called the closure case, where the state prosecutor brought a case against the Justice and Development Party, saying that the party violated the Constitution because the party was a center of anti-secular activity. Turkey is an officially secular republic. Now, when we say secular, you guys are all Americans, you get the sense of what secular is, right? Secular, you can, have your faith, do whatever you want to do, whatever. You want to wear a big cross, you can wear a big cross. You want to wear a yarmulke, you can wear a yarmulke. You want to wear a headscarf, you can wear a headscarf. You want to pray. I'm from New York. I grew up in the New York area. I spent time living in Manhattan. And this is my favorite example of a kind of secular side. Anybody here from New York? Yes, where? Brooklyn. All right, I'm from the Bronx. Okay. And Brooklyn, cool. Anyway, so this will ring true to you. This, to me, and of course, New York, maybe you consider, New York as a country unto itself. But by the way, it actually is part of the United States, and all the people who live there, for the most part, are Americans. I should let you know. But this is, to me, is kind of the quintessential statement on secularism in the United States. Okay, the famous guy, the famous hot dog stands in New York City with the yellow and blue umbrellas? And they're selling Subret hot dogs. Those are kosher hot dogs. Kosher hot dogs, okay? Every dude who sells kosher hot dogs in New York City, every dude, tell me if I'm wrong, is Egyptian from one province of Egypt called Menafea, which, by the way, is the same province that former Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak is from. He probably would have been better off selling hot dogs in New York than, you know what happened. Okay. And on Fridays, okay, so maybe they're not all from Egypt, maybe there's okay. And on Fridays, a lot of these guys roll out their prayer mats and they pray during prayer time while they're selling kosher hot dogs. In between, on the phone, yammering away to their brother in Menafea. No one bats an eyelash. No one cares. People step over them. They're like, hey, when you're done praying, I'd like 2 with sauerkraut. How much is that pretzel? It's totally cool. That's kind of, to me, the quintessential statement of secularism here in the United States. In Turkey, that's not the case. In Turkey, you have something that's more like what you have in France. And what the Turks call it, the term is laïclar. Comes from the French term, laïcisme, which is essentially government control over the public expression of religion, which is why the military objected to Mrs. Gül being in the presidential palace, because she wears Islamic headscarf. I could lecture for 3 hours on this, but just keep that in mind. So the point was that this party was violating the secular principles of the republic. Remember, my background, first thing, this endless struggle over culture and identity. Okay. These were efforts to undermine the Justice and Development Party. These three things. Now, before anybody jumps all over me, the Ergenekon conspiracy of June 2007, this thing that was supposed to destabilize the country and invite the military in to restore order, became a conspiracy within a conspiracy within a conspiracy that the Justice and Development Party and its allies, its then allies, because those same people are now being jailed by Erdogan and the Justice and Development Party, but they used the alleged conspiracy to turn the tables on their then enemies, and they jailed all kinds of people. Journalists, academics, others, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, they used it, they framed a narrative around these three events that the Turkish establishment was trying to undermine the Justice and Development Party. So you have within these three things, oh my God, my coffee, my water is going to go everywhere. You guys are
You're right.
not a good guest. You had within these three things, you had that endless struggle over culture and identity. You had the paranoia of the leadership kicking in. You had, again, a weak opposition that couldn't take advantage of any of this. And an international environment that was like, oh yeah, Erdogan's arresting people, but he's a good ally, so what do we really care? All of these things actually failed to undermine the Justice and Development Party. They were all victories for Erdogan and the Justice and Development Party. The Eni coup failed. The effort of the military to prevent Gül from becoming the president of the republic totally failed. Erdogan, sensing where the Turkish people were, called a general election and won almost 50% of the vote, which put the military, which always thought of itself as being so popular, on the defensive, especially given the fact that there were protests during this period that said no to Sharia, no to Islamic law, and no to military rule. So when the Justice and Development Party won 47% of the popular vote in snap elections, there really was no question that Abdullah Gül would become the president of the republic. Then, actually ruled that the Justice and Development Party was a center of anti-secular activity, but they didn't have enough votes on the Constitutional Court to actually close the party. This was one of the reforms that the Justice and Development Party had pushed through a number of years earlier. So even though they were found to be in a center of anti-secular activity, they had to pay a fine of $20 million. At that point, they had been in power, 8, 9 years? No. 2007, 2008, so wait, my math. 6 years. By that time, this party had the country completely wired. The patronage was rolling. $20 million was like in Erdogan's sock drawer. No problem, they just continued on. And then, of course, I explained how Ergenekon, the tables were turned on the opposition. Well, what did they do? Well, like I said before, out went consensus. Out went the idea of reform. Out went trying to build, if you believe that they ever did, and I do believe they did, out went the idea of building a broad coalition of Turks, of liberal-minded Turks, of Kurds, of pious Turks, of big business. Out went that broad coalition that they rode to power in that 2007 vote. And Erdogan pursued a policy of polarization and, quite honestly, a policy to destroy his opposition. So, what did they do? They began with a crackdown on the press. Individual journalists were arrested. Editors were arrested. They were intimidated. There was crackdown on media companies. It's a famous case. It's back in the news this week. It's a group called the Doğan Media Group that Erdogan and his party, being the party of government, used the bureaucracy to go after the Doğan Media Group because Erdogan did not like the way he was being covered. Ooh, that sounds sort of familiar. I shouldn't say that too often. And the tax authority levied a $2.5 billion fine on the Doğan Media Group. What was this all about? Well, a couple of intrepid journalists from the major newspaper that the Doğan Media Group owned, the Hürriyet Daily, was covering a trial in Germany. And that trial in Germany had to do with agents of the Justice and Development Party in Germany raising money from the Turkish community in Germany for the use of that money was supposed to go back home and help poor people out, whatever. What they were really doing is they were funneling money to cronies connected to the Justice and Development Party so that they would buy up media companies and change their editorial line to make them pro-government. And Hürriyet was following this very, very closely. And Hürriyet was owned by the Doğan Media Group. And coincidentally, the Doğan Media Group was found to owe $2.5 billion in taxes. Now, there was some funny things, like these big families that traditionally controlled the Turkish economy did do funny business, but it seemed excessively punitive. By dint of all this, by jailing journalists, by intimidating them, by going after editors, by changing the ownership of media companies, what the Justice and Development Party essentially did was create a virtual ministry of information. Throughout the Arab world, there are ministries of information, or state media, so on and so forth. In Turkey, you didn't have the same kind of thing, but what you did have was now the vast majority of media was owned by people who were partial to the government. By the time, and then a variety of other things, I'm going to go over time if I go through everything, but by the time the Gezi Park protests happened in 2013, I was in the Gezi Park protests. I wasn't there to protest, I happened to be in Turkey and witness them. I stood on the sideline and tweeted about them. I did suck in a lot of Turkish tear gas, which was very bad. The worst is Turkish water cannon, because they actually include pepper spray in the water cannon, so when it touches your skin, it burns. Fortunately, I avoided that, but I saw many people who were victimized by that. By the time the Gezi Park protests happened in 2013, the Justice and Development Party had been in power 10.5 years. And whereas they had broadened political participation, whereas people who had never participated in politics before were now participating in politics in ways that they had never before, they had also narrowed the ability of people to contest politics. Those people in Gezi Park who were protesting were called by the Deputy Prime Minister and one of the other founders of the Justice and Development Party, a guy named Bülent Arınç. He called them the marginals. My response to that, when I heard him calling these people the marginals, and believe me, they weren't marginal. They weren't huge numbers of people. 60,000 people in Istanbul, but these were protests that were all over the country. Them marginals. And I said, no, they've been marginalized by the Justice and Development Party, by the way in which the Justice and Development Party at that point had altered or hollowed out or manipulated the institutions of the Turkish state. Last couple of points. After that, you had the revelations of a tremendous corruption scandal, which began an open war with the Gülen movement. Does anybody here know who Fethullah Gülen is? All right, so let me go into that. Of course, the Turks know who he is. Fethullah Gülen is a Turkish cleric who went into self-imposed exile in 1999. And he lives in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. He lives in a town called Saylorsburg, Pennsylvania, which is about an hour and a half from Philadelphia, which is kind of hilarious, to be honest with you. Because President Erdogan doesn't refer to Gülen by his name. He refers to him as Pennsylvania. When you hear him fulminating against the Gülenists, he just refers to Pennsylvania. But he's only talking about one resident of Pennsylvania. What about all the other millions of people in Pennsylvania? I did my doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania. Now, is anybody here a grad student? All right, you're a grad student, right? So you're not like rah-rah MSU. I wasn't really rah-rah Penn, but But I went there, so I bought a University of Pennsylvania t-shirt. And my University of Pennsylvania t-shirt just says Pennsylvania. And when I wasn't persona non grata in Turkey, I was going to Turkey once every 3 months, I'd have to stop myself when I was packing to make sure that my Pennsylvania t-shirt didn't go into my bag, because that for sure would get me arrested walking around Istanbul with a Pennsylvania t-shirt. Hey, I want to talk about politics. I'm wearing my Pennsylvania t-shirt. I would have been, not a rapper, I would have been killed. Anyway, so Fethullah Gulen is this cleric who used to be tight with Erdogan. They come from different kind of streams of Islamist thinking in Turkey, but they had common enemies. The military, the establishment, et cetera, et cetera. And they cooperate. Remember I talked about that Ergenekon conspiracy? It was the Gulenists who manufactured a lot of the, quite frankly, BS evidence against the people that they didn't like. Now there was a falling out beginning in 2013 between the Gulenists and President Erdogan, for reasons I could spend hours talking about, but just believe me, there was a falling out. That is when this purge that, if you read the press, have been talking about and dated back to July 2016, it was actually late 2013, early 2014 when this purge began. And the purge has targeted anybody who could be accused of being a Gulenist. To the point where, and it's gotten to this point, where if you look at someone the wrong way, they can accuse you of being a Gulenist, and you could be in a lot of trouble. You can be in a lot of trouble. All of these authoritarian tendencies that we have seen over the course of, how many years has it been since 2007? 11 years? Have been reinforced by the renewal of war with the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, a terrorist organization that has been waging war against the Turkish state since President Trump was married to Ivana Trump. That goes over well with much older audiences. Meaning the mid-1980s. You guys don't remember Ivana Trump.
I believe 1983.
83, 84, same, around that time. The fight, as I talked about with the Gulenists, the war in Syria and what that has done, and the trauma that has caused, not just in Syria but also within Turkey, the emergence of ISIS as an existential threat to countries around Turkey, as well as ISIS attacks on Turkey, even as Turkey has not coordinated with ISIS necessarily, but certainly coordinated with other extremist groups in the region, and of course the failed coup d'etat of 2016. All of these things have reinforced these authoritarian tendencies, and then of course you have the kind of two, to my mind, examples, perfect examples of where Turkey is now, and I'll end on this. In June of 2015, Turkey had a general election, a regularly scheduled general election. And the Justice and Development Party, which had ruled without a coalition, been the sole party of government since November 2002, it won 40% of the vote. 40% of the vote is darn good. But for the Justice and Development Party, it was a stinging defeat, requiring a coalition government. So President Erdogan tapped his hand-picked prime minister to go out and find a coalition partner to establish a government. They had 45 days to establish a government, and if they couldn't, then there would have to be new elections in 60 days. A caretaker government would come to power, and there would be new elections. Well, from the moment that President Erdogan tapped his hand-picked prime minister to form a coalition government, he and his advisors in the presidential palace did everything possible to undermine those coalition talks. And they did. And they had to have new elections. And they held those elections in November 2015. And guess what? The Justice and Development Party got 49.95% of the vote, which is exactly what they had gotten in the previous election, which meant that they could rule without a coalition government. So this country that in 2005 began negotiations to join the European Union 10 years later had a general election in which the leader did not like the outcome of the election and made sure there would be a new election and that would result in an outcome that he liked. That is a stark example of how far Turkey traveled in those 10 years. And then the second stark example, and I'll end on this, and then we can, you guys can correct whatever I said. In April of last year, a year ago, the Turks held a constitutional referendum. They held a referendum on 18 articles of the Constitution. The proposed changes to the Constitution would give President Erdogan unprecedented presidential powers. You may have read in the press or something that you had to read assigned in a class that the Turkish president is primarily ceremonial or symbolic. That's not true. That's not true. The Turkish president is supposed to be above politics, and every president since before Erdogan has been above politics, but has some very, very important powers. Erdogan came to the office of the presidency determined to empower the presidency beyond its powers because he had been a prime minister for so long. And he did that, but he wanted, like many authoritarians do, he wanted to situate his new powers within law. And so they held a referendum on 18 articles of the Constitution that would widely expand the powers of the presidency. The entire machinery of the Turkish state was mobilized to get a yes vote. They won that. The yes votes won, but they didn't win at the same time. There was credible evidence of, how shall I put this diplomatic, electoral chicanery. If you don't know that word, look it up. But I'm sure since you're all very smart MSU students, you know what chicanery is. Basically, what they did was, once again going back on their own reforms, they had pushed through a reform saying that ballots had to be stamped for them to be valid. You do your vote, you go to an election commission official, they wham the seal on it, they put it in the ballot box, and then it's counted. All ballots, this reform said, ballots that did not have this official seal should be thrown out. In the midst of this referendum, when it was clear that they may not get this yes vote, meaning Erdogan, who had coveted what they call the executive presidency since at least 2011, might lose this referendum. All of a sudden, the Supreme Election Commission, or the Higher Election Commission, correct my Turkish, said,